and welcome to my lecture recital, The Irish Flute. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to share this material with all of you. So, why did I choose this topic? I'll start with a silly answer. I've felt a connection to Irish music since elementary school, where I had the privilege and honor of performing recorder solos at our yearly St. Patrick's Day concerts, and that seems funny to think about, but it actually made me really love Irish music and feel a connection with it from the start. After having learned a few classical flute pieces with Irish influences, I really wanted to explore the roots of Irish folk music, and I felt like learning more about Irish folk music would really inform my classical flute playing as well. And I'm also a little bit Irish, so I thought, why not exploit that? So during this recital, I'll give an overview of Irish folk music, including a brief history and performance practice, and then I'll move on to explain and demonstrate how Irish folk music influenced 3 contemporary flute pieces. Following the lecture, I will be performing those 3 contemporary flute pieces. Thank you again so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy my presentation, The Irish Flute. So let's start with a brief history of Irish folk music. Ireland has more than one type of music, but the type of music I'll be focusing on today is Irish traditional music, which is also known as Irish folk music. This music came from Gaelic Ireland, which is a political and social culture that existed in Ireland from all the way back to the prehistoric era up until the 17th century. Many people associate this type of music with the arrival of Christianity in the early 5th century, but there are records of musicians existing in Ireland more than 1,000 years before Christianity. These musicians performed ancient Hebrew melodies, which later influenced Christian hymns. Since then, Irish national melodies have been passed down from century to century and reattribute their simplicity and expressivity to church music. So here's an example of an old Irish folk song performed on the harp. So I think the quote on the left-hand part of the slide really sums up the nature of Irish music. Ireland is rich in literature that understands a soul's yearning and dancing that understands a happy heart. So let's talk about some characteristics of Irish folk music. In Gaelic Ireland, folk music used about 10 different instruments listed here, and 2 of those instruments are from the flute family. So we have the flute and the fife. This music is usually performed in spaces where people organically gather, like bars, restaurants, parks, and people's houses. And sheet music isn't typically used, so performers are expected to have songs memorized and ready to play at any time in different keys. So here is an example of a traditional Irish folk ensemble performing in an Irish pub. As you heard in the video, Irish folk music usually features long, spinning melodies that can be ornamented by the performers, which makes the music feel more like improvisation. So in that video, the flutist on the left-hand side was playing the melody, and the flutist on the right-hand side was ornamenting over it by adding some trills and changing some rhythms. There is usually an abundance of notes in the melody, and the melody is usually played by the flute, fiddle, tin whistle, or bagpipes. The accompaniment is pretty simple. The harmony is usually diatonic, meaning the harmonies come from notes within the main key signature of the piece. And the music is usually modal, so the harmony comes from different types of musical scales, and it doesn't often leave those types of scales. Since the melody is so prominent in this music, the accompanimental rhythm is also really simple. You'll usually hear guitar, harp, and percussion as accompaniment instruments. The form of Irish folk music is usually pretty simple as well. It's broken down into two sections. So you have an A section and a B section. And these sections just repeat ad lib. And it's really up to the performer to decide, okay, now it's time to move on from the A section to the B section. And it's also up to the performers to decide when they're going to end the piece. So here's an example of another Irish folk ensemble. So the video that we saw before in the pub was more of a traditional ensemble in terms of instruments. So even though it was recorded in 2011, the Irish flutes were traditional flutes. There was a traditional fiddle being used. There was traditional bagpipes. And in this recording, you're going to see some more modern instruments mixed with those traditional instruments. So I absolutely love this video. I love the music being played. I love the expressivity and the simplicity of it. And I love the combination of instruments. And I also love the performance setting. So, the past video we saw was in a pub, and this video is taking place outside in an open field. It seems so organic for the music that's being played. And there's a mixture of traditional instruments with modern instruments. So we have a traditional harp and percussion, but then we also have modern instruments like the flute and the violin. Flutes have been a staple in Irish folk music for centuries. The Irish flute was typically wooden with no keys, but a few keys were added later on to help improve pitch and technique. These flutes aren't actually native to Ireland, so even though they're called Irish flutes, they're native to 17th century Germany. By the time they made it to Ireland, the modern silver flute had already been invented, but Irish flutes preferred the mellow sounds of the wooden flute, so they continue to use it in folk performance today, as you saw in the earlier Irish traditional ensemble video performed in the pub. Both flutists were using Irish flutes. They had a couple of keys on them, so their pitch and technique have improved over time. So here's an example of an Irish flutist performing a traditional Irish reel. And an Irish reel is any Irish song used for any type of dance. This is Orlith McAuliffe performing The Windmill. I love the Irish flute. I love the sound it produces. It's so mellow, but it's also really energetic, and it's so consistent. It's so consistent, the sound. From the low register to the middle register to the high register of the flute, it sounds so even and beautiful. And in this video, you can see a lot of the characteristics of Irish folk music that I was talking about earlier. So long spinning melodies. Orlith adds a lot of improvisational embellishments. So she adds trills. You can see her fingers moving on the keys in this kind of direction. So those are called stops. And she repeats each section of the piece. So there's an A section and a B section. And you can hear the melody underneath all of the improvisational ornaments. Though the flute is so important in Irish folk music, there aren't many classical flute pieces influenced by it. Most Irish composers wrote either classical or folk music, but not both. So there's a huge lack of repertoire. Those composers that did combine elements of classical and folk music mostly wrote operas and choral music, not works for flute. One of the reasons we may not see much crossover is because of the nature of Irish folk music versus the nature of Western classical music, and I'm talking tradition of performance practice. So Irish folk musicians usually learn songs without using sheet music. They learn songs by ear, and there's no barrier between performers and audience. Translating the feeling of songs is the most important element of Irish folk music, not necessarily sticking to what the composer wanted. In Western classical tradition, performers use sheet music and they're taught to stick to the composer's instructions as closely as possible. Performance settings are often more divided between the performers and the audience, and conductors are used to bring out musicality. So, thinking of Western classical music, you usually see those performances in a concert hall, and there's usually that barrier of stage and audience, and there's a conductor standing above the orchestra. So that's the kind of divide that I'm talking about in Western classical music. So here's an example of perhaps the most famous flute crossover work, which includes classical and folk elements. This is James Galway. He has recorded pretty much everything under the sun, but he records both Irish folk music and Western classical music at an extremely high level. And when you think of Irish folk music, as a classical musician, you think, of course, James Galway. You're always going to go to James Galway. So here's James Galway performing in Ireland, which is a piece by Hamilton Harty. This piece was originally written for flute and orchestra, but this recording features flute and piano. Hamilton Harty wrote this piece to depict a flutist in various folk settings in Ireland. So this clip is from the beginning of this piece, and it depicts a flutist playing out in a town square, basically walking the streets of Ireland playing folk music. And then later on in the piece, Hamilton Harty incorporates more Irish reel and dance-like music with faster rhythms and a lot of ornaments like trills. So now that you've heard the modern flute and you've heard the Irish flute playing traditional music, we can talk about their differences. So the Irish and modern flutes are very different in terms of sound production and also technical capabilities. So this video of James Galway, you hear a lot of the technical sides of the modern flute. The modern flute is complex. It contains many keys, tone holes, and pitch possibilities. It can be made of silver, gold, and any other combination of metal. But the Irish flute is just a bare bones version of the modern flute. The sound is very difficult to mimic on the modern flute. So I'm sure that you heard that James Galway's sound, it was warm and beautiful like the Irish flute, but it was more metallic and more sparkling. There are only a handful of classical flute works with Irish folk elements, 3 of which I'll be performing and discussing today. The first is called Lughnasa, written in 2003 by composer and flutist Rhonda Larson. Though she was born in Montana, Rhonda Larson is one of the only flute composers to combine both classical and Irish folk elements in her music. Here are her program notes for Lughnasa. She says, Prior to naming the piece, I was writing as inspired by J.S. Bach's Violin Prelude No. 12. I wanted to have it like a violin fiddle piece, and the Celtic flavor showed up all on its own. Like many of my other solos, the harmony is built into the flute part. She then titled the piece Lughnasa, which is the name of a mythological Celtic feast. This feast celebrates abundance during harvest time, which is reflected through very, very fast-paced and never-ending flute notes, trust me. Other Irish folk elements include ornaments when melodies repeat. So the first melody that you'll hear sounds like this. And then it repeats with a little bit of ornamentation. And this repeats and repeats throughout the piece. This piece can be performed solo or with harp and or percussion. And the option to choose your instrumentation reminds me a lot of Irish folk music, because like the bar we saw earlier, you have to be ready to play with whoever shows up with whatever instruments in whatever key and whatever form that they choose to play the piece. This piece also has a steady tempo like Irish folk music. It has a super dance-like feeling, similar to an Irish reel. There are two main sections which repeat in different keys throughout the piece. So what I just played is the A section. It has repeated 16th notes. Now hear what the B sections sound like. They feature sextuplets instead of 16th notes, and they're slurred instead of tongued. So now let's talk about Western classical elements. The virtuosic technique required to perform the B sections at the written tempo make this piece more conducive to the classical flute because it is super, super technically challenging. Another way to westernize this piece would be to perform it with piano accompaniment instead of harp and percussion. So when you get the score for this piece, it contains a multitude of things. So it contains the flute part, it contains a harp part, and it contains a piano part. But Rhonda Larson wrote, if you can, please don't play this with piano because it is just kind of a last resort. But oftentimes it's what classical musicians have access to. So she'd rather that you perform it in a traditional way with flute and percussion. And it doesn't come with a percussion part because she says that the percussionist should be able to improvise. And each performance of this piece, every time she performs it, she said it turns out totally different from the last performance because of that improvisational nature and because of the changes that you can make in accompaniment. next work we'll be discussing is 4 songs written in 2006 by Rhona Clarke. This is the only piece on today's program written by an Irish composer. In Irish folk music, it's common to base songs off of the poetic nature of the Irish language. I believe this is what Rhona Clarke was hoping to achieve because she based each movement off of the rhythm and speech inflections within 4 poems. Rhona Clarke wanted the flute to sing the poems, just as a flute would as a melodic instrument in an Irish folk ensemble. You can especially hear the first line of each poem being sung by the flute. So the first movement is called Begin. Begin again to the summoning birds. The second movement is called As Kingfishers Catch Fire, and the first line is As Kingfishers Catch Fire. The third poem is called Elegy, and the first line is I lay down in my grave and watch my children grow. The fourth poem is called Take Time Out, and it begins Take Time Out. So you can really hear how the flute sings those lines. These 4 movements include a lot of short, repeating melodies offering small ornaments during repetitions, which is very folk-like. More Western classical elements include frequent use of the tritone interval, so this is a really menacing sound that Rhona Clarke uses a lot, which you wouldn't hear in a traditional Irish folk setting. So it's a kind of scary, uncertain sound that we didn't hear in any of the Irish traditional music from before. Clarke also incorporates classical elements like frequent meter and tempo changes, lots of crescendos and decrescendos, which the wooden Irish flute wouldn't have been able to produce as effectively as the modern flute. She also incorporates flutter tonguing, which is an extended technique where essentially you roll your R's and blow air at the same time. So this is something you wouldn't typically hear in Irish folk music, but you hear a lot in contemporary classical music.
Begin again to the carolling birds, to the sight of light at the window. Begin to the roar of morning traffic all along Pembroke Road. Every beginning is a promise, born in light and dying in dark. Determination and exultation of springtime, flowering the way to work. Begin to the pageant of queuing girls, to the arrogant loneliness of swans in the canal, to bridges linking the past and future, to old friends passing, though with us still. Begin to the loneliness that cannot end, since it perhaps is what makes us begin. Begin to wonder at unknown faces, at crying birds in the sudden rain, at branches dark in the willing sunlight, at seagulls foraging for bread, at couples sharing a sunny secret, alone together while making good. Though we live in a world that dreams of ending, that always seems about to give in, something that will not acknowledge conclusion, insists that we forever begin.
As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim and roundy wells, stones ring, like each tucked string tells. Each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves, goes itself. Myself it speaks and spells, crying what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. I lay down in my grave and watch my children grow, proud blooms above the weeds of death. Their petals wave, and still nobody knows the soft black dirt that is my winding sheet. The worms, my friends, yet tunnel holes in bones, and through those apertures I see the rain. The sun felt warm now jabs within my space, and brings me roots of my children born. Their seeds must fall and press beneath this earth, and find me where I wait, my only need to fertilize their birth. I lay down in my grave and watch my children grow.
Take time out. Oh, you can sell your soul for money, then run off to the country for your cookouts and your parties on the lawns. While our children seek sedation in Eastern meditation or visions that go shooting up their arms. When you know that youth is dying on the run, and my daughter trades dope stories with your son, we better ask, what's all the bleeding and the needing, the killing and the thrilling all about? We better take time out and accept the fact that I am a rainbow in somebody's cloud, and I thank you.
The last piece I'll be performing today is a flute concerto written in 1993 by Christopher Rouse. Despite being born in America, Christopher Rouse wrote this flute concerto in response to feelings of nostalgia for Ireland, which is similar to why I'm giving this recital. I've never been there, I don't know much about it, but I have this feeling of nostalgia for the music of Ireland. Christopher Rouse said, "Although both of my parents' families immigrated to America well before the Revolutionary War, I nonetheless still feel a deep ancestral tug of recognition whenever I'm exposed to the arts and traditions of the British Isles, particularly those of Celtic origin." The concerto has 5 separate movements, and I'll be performing the 4th and 5th movements. The 4th movement resembles an Irish jig, which is a lively folk dance in compound meter. This movement has a really nice lilt to it. It starts out nice and cute like an Irish jig, but it gets really twisted by the end, and you'll hear that in a little bit. Other Irish traditional influences include call and response passages between the flute and orchestra, and the instrumentation. So Rouse chose to add extra percussion instruments and harp to the orchestra, which isn't usually traditional, and it gives the piece more of a folk-like feel. Rouse incorporates Western classical elements like an extremely fast tempo. So the example I just played was a little bit under tempo. He also includes non-diatonic and crunchy harmonies. Non-diatonic harmony refers to harmonies containing notes outside of the key of the piece. The 5th movement of this concerto is titled Amran, which is Gaelic for song. This movement is reminiscent of simple, church-like melodies that first influenced Irish folk music. The simple flute melody soars over the orchestral strings throughout this movement. Here's the opening melody. When this melody returns for the second time, Rouse adds light ornaments like grace notes and trills, which are reminiscent of improvised Irish folk embellishments. So you can still hear the original melody within that. He just adds a couple other notes and embellishments for color. Rouse incorporates more Western classical elements by calling for an extremely slow tempo, and he plays with harmony just like he did in the fourth movement. Before I play the Rouse Concerto, I want to say a few quick thank yous. First of all, thank you so much to everyone watching. It means so much to me that my friends and family can take part in this from different parts of the country, and I'm so happy to share this project with all of you. Thank you to my collaborators, Katie on percussion and Alexei on piano, for their awesome musicianship and for their willingness to collaborate with me on this interesting virtual format. Thank you so much to my friends who sent me their amazing pictures from Ireland, which you'll see during the next piece. Thank you to my boyfriend Michael for answering all of my questions about video editing. And thank you to my dog Simba for being so quiet as I record this lecture and as I have recorded all of my music for it. I also want to thank my amazing professor, Dr. Sarah Frisoff at the University of Maryland. Thank you for your willingness to work with me as I present this virtual lecture recital, and thank you for being a great mentor and an inspiration to me during my first 2 years at the university. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Here is Rouse's Concerto for Flute and Piano.
Thank you.